Part 3, Chapter 1, The Fete, First Part, Section 3. There was a feeling in the hall that something was wrong again. Let me state to begin with that I have the deepest reverence for genius. But why do our geniuses in the decline of their illustrious years behave sometimes exactly like little boys? What though he was Karmazinov, and came forward with as much dignity as 5 Kammerherrs rolled into one? How could he expect to keep an audience like ours listening for a whole hour to a single paper? I have observed, in fact, that however big a genius a man may be, he can't monopolize the attention of an audience at a frivolous literary matinée for more than 20 minutes with impunity. The entrance of the great writer was received, indeed, with the utmost respect. Even the severest elderly men showed signs of approval and interest, and the ladies even displayed some enthusiasm. The applause was brief, however, and somehow uncertain and not unanimous. Yet there was no unseemly behaviour in the back rows till Karmazinov began to speak. Not that anything very bad followed then, but only a sort of misunderstanding. I have mentioned already that he had rather a shrill voice, almost feminine in fact, and at the same time a genuinely aristocratic lisp. He had hardly articulated a few words when someone had the effrontery to laugh aloud, probably some ignorant simpleton who knew nothing of the world and was congenitally disposed to laughter. But there was nothing like a hostile demonstration. On the contrary, people said "Sh!" and the offender was crushed. But Mr. Karmazinov, with an affected air and intonation, announced that at first he had declined absolutely to read. Much need there was to mention it. There are some lines which come so deeply from the heart that it is impossible to utter them aloud, so that these holy things cannot be laid before the public. Why lay them then? But as he had been begged to do so, he was doing so, and as he was, moreover, laying down his pen forever, and had sworn to write no more, he had written this last farewell. And as he had sworn never on any inducement to read anything in public, and so on, all in that style. But all that would not have mattered. Every one knows what authors' prefaces are like, though, I may observe, that considering the lack of culture of our audience and the irritability of the back rows, all this may have had an influence. Surely it would have been better to have read a little story, a short tale such as he had written in the past, over elaborate, that is, and affected, but sometimes witty. It would have saved the situation. No, this was quite another story, it was a regular oration. Good heavens, what wasn't there in it? I am positive that it would have reduced to rigidity even a Petersburg audience, let alone ours. Imagine an article that would have filled some 30 pages of print of the most affected, aimless prattle, and to make matters worse, the gentleman read it with a sort of melancholy condescension as though it were a favour, so that it was almost insulting to the audience. The subject who could make it out? It was a sort of description of certain impressions and reminiscences, but of what, and about what? Though the leading intellects of the province did their utmost during the first half of the reading, they could make nothing of it, and they listened to the second part simply out of politeness. A great deal was said about love, indeed of the love of the genius for some person, but I must admit it made rather an awkward impression. For the great writer to tell us about his first kiss seemed to my mind a little incongruous with his short and fat little figure. Another thing that was offensive: these kisses did not occur as they do with the rest of mankind. There had to be a framework of gorse it had to be gorse, or some such plant that one must look up in a flora and there had to be a tint of purple in the sky, such as no mortal had ever observed before, or if some people had seen it they had never noticed it, but he seemed to say, "I have seen it and am describing it to you, fools," as if it were a most ordinary thing. The tree under which the interesting couple sat had, of course, to be of an orange colour. They were sitting somewhere in Germany. Suddenly they see Pompey or Cassius on the eve of a battle, and both are penetrated by a thrill of ecstasy. Some wood nymph squeaked in the bushes. Gluck played the violin among the reeds. The title of the piece he was playing was given in full, but no one knew it, so that one would have had to look it up in a musical dictionary. Meanwhile a fog came on, such a fog, that it was more like a million pillows than a fog. And suddenly everything disappears, and the great genius is crossing the frozen Volga in a thaw. 2½ pages are filled with the crossing, and yet he falls through the ice. The genius is drowning. You imagine he was drowned? Not a bit of it. This was simply in order that when he was drowning, and at his last gasp, he might catch sight of a bit of ice the size of a pea, but pure and crystal as a frozen tear, and in that tear was reflected Germany, or, more accurately, the sky of Germany, and its iridescent sparkle recalled to his mind the very tear which, dost thou remember, fell from thine eyes when we were sitting under that emerald tree, and thou didst cry out joyfully, 'There is no crime!' 'No,' I said through my tears, 'but if that is so, there are no righteous either.' We sobbed, and parted for ever. She went off somewhere to the sea coast, while he went to visit some caves, and then he descends and descends and descends for 3 years under Suharev Tower in Moscow, and suddenly in the very bowels of the earth he finds in a cave a lamp, and before the lamp a hermit. The hermit is praying. The genius leans against a little barred window and suddenly hears a sigh. Do you suppose it was the hermit sighing? Much he cares about the hermit! Not a bit of it. This sigh simply reminds him of her first sigh, 37 years before. 'In Germany, when dost thou remember, we sat under an agate tree, and thou didst say to me, "Why, love? See, ochra is growing all around, and I love thee, but the ochra will cease to grow, and I shall cease to love."' Then the fog comes on again, Hoffmann appears on the scene, the wood nymph whistles a tune from Chopin, and suddenly out of the fog appears Ancus Marcius over the roofs of Rome, wearing a laurel wreath. 'A chill of ecstasy ran down our backs, and we parted for ever,' and so on, and so on. Perhaps I am not reporting it quite right, and don't know how to report it, but the drift of the babble was something of that sort. And after all, how disgraceful this passion of our great intellects for jesting in a superior way really is. The great European philosopher, the great man of science, the inventor, the martyr, all these who labor and are heavy laden, are to the great Russian genius no more than so many cooks in his kitchen. He is the master, and they come to him, cap in hand, awaiting orders. It is true he jeers superciliously at Russia too, and there is nothing he likes better than exhibiting the bankruptcy of Russia in every relation before the great minds of Europe, but as regards himself, no, he is at a higher level than all the great minds of Europe, they are only material for his jests. He takes another man's idea, tacks on to it its antithesis, and the epigram is made. There is such a thing as crime, there is no such thing as crime, there is no such thing as justice, there are no just men, atheism, Darwinism, the Moscow bells, but alas, he no longer believes in the Moscow bells. Rome, laurels, but he has no belief in laurels even. We have a conventional attack of Byronic spleen, a grimace from Heine, something of Petchorin, and the machine goes on rolling, whistling at full speed. But you may praise me, you may praise me, that I like extremely. It's only in a manner of speaking that I lay down the pen. I shall bore you 300 times more, you'll grow weary of reading me." Of course, it did not end without trouble, but the worst of it was that it was his own doing. People had for some time begun shuffling their feet, blowing their noses, coughing, and doing everything that people do when a lecturer, whoever he may be, keeps an audience for longer than 20 minutes at a literary matinee. But the genius noticed nothing of all this. He went on lisping and mumbling without giving a thought to the audience, so that everyone began to wonder. Suddenly, in a back row, a solitary but loud voice was heard. "Good Lord, what nonsense!" The exclamation escaped involuntarily, and I'm sure was not intended as a demonstration. The man was simply worn out. But Mr. Karmazinov stopped, looked sarcastically at the audience, and suddenly lisped with the deportment of an aggrieved Kammerherr. "I'm afraid I've been boring you dreadfully, gentlemen?" That was his blunder, that he was the first to speak. For provoking an answer in this way, he gave an opening for the rabble to speak too, and even legitimately, so to say, while if he had restrained himself, people would have gone on blowing their noses, and it would have passed off somehow. Perhaps he expected applause in response to his question. But there was no sound of applause. On the contrary, every one seemed to subside and shrink back in dismay. You never did see Ancus Marcius, that's all brag," cried a voice that sounded full of irritation and even nervous exhaustion. "Just so," another voice agreed at once. "There are no such things as ghosts nowadays, nothing but natural science. Look it up in a scientific book." "Gentlemen, there was nothing I expected less than such objections," said Karmazinov, extremely surprised. The great genius had completely lost touch with his fatherland in Karlsruhe. "Nowadays it's outrageous to say that the world stands on three fishes," a young lady snapped out suddenly. "You can't have gone down to the hermit's cave, Karmazinov, and who talks about hermits nowadays?" "Gentlemen, what surprises me most of all is that you take it all so seriously. However, you are perfectly right. No one has greater respect for truth and realism than I have." Though he smiled ironically, he was tremendously overcome. His face seemed to express: "I am not the sort of man you think. I am on your side. Only praise me more, as much as possible. I like it extremely." "Gentlemen," he cried, completely mortified at last, "I see that my poor poem is quite out of place here. And indeed I am out of place here myself, I think." "You threw at the crow and you hit the cow," some fool, probably drunk, shouted at the top of his voice, and of course no notice ought to have been taken of him. It is true there was a sound of disrespectful laughter. "A cow, you say?" Karmazinov caught it up at once, his voice grew shriller and shriller. "As for crows and cows, gentlemen, I will refrain. I've too much respect for any audience to permit myself comparisons, however harmless. But I did think..." "You'd better be careful, sir," someone shouted from a back row. "But I had supposed that laying aside my pen and saying farewell to my readers, I should be heard." "No, no, we want to hear you, we want to," a few voices from the front row plucked up spirit to exclaim at last. "Read, read!" several enthusiastic ladies' voices chimed in, and at last there was an outburst of applause, sparse and feeble, it is true. "Believe me, Karmazinov, every one looks on it as an honour," the marshal's wife herself could not resist saying. "Mr. Karmazinov!" cried a fresh young voice in the back of the hall suddenly. It was the voice of a very young teacher from the district school, who had only lately come among us, an excellent young man, quiet and gentlemanly. He stood up in his place. "Mr. Karmazinov, if I had the happiness to fall in love as you have described to us, I really shouldn't refer to my love in an article intended for public reading." He flushed red all over. "Ladies and gentlemen," cried Karmazinov, "I have finished. I will omit the end and withdraw. Only allow me to read the 6 last lines." "Yes, dear reader, farewell," he began at once from the manuscript without sitting down again in his chair. "Farewell, reader. I do not greatly insist on our parting friends. What need to trouble you, indeed? You may abuse me as you will, if it affords you any satisfaction. But best of all, if we forget one another forever, and if you all readers were suddenly so kind as to fall on your knees and begin begging me with tears, 'Write, oh, write for us, Karmazinov, for the sake of Russia, for the sake of posterity, to win laurels,' even then I would answer you, thanking you, of course, with every courtesy, 'No, we've had enough of one another, dear fellow countrymen. Merci. It's time we took our separate ways. Merci, merci, merci.'" Karmazinov bowed ceremoniously, and, as red as though he had been cooked, retired behind the scenes. "Nobody would go down on their knees. A wild idea!" "What conceit?" "That's only humour," someone more reasonable suggested. "Spare me your humour." "I call it impudence, gentlemen." "Well, he's finished now, anyway." "Ech, what a dull show!" But all these ignorant exclamations in the back rows, though they were confined to the back rows, were drowned in applause from the other half of the audience. They called for Karmazinov. Several ladies with Yulia Mihailovna and the marshal's wife crowded round the platform. In Yulia Mihailovna's hands was a gorgeous laurel wreath resting on another wreath of living roses on a white velvet cushion. "Laurels," Karmazinov pronounced, with a subtle and rather sarcastic smile. "I am touched, of course, and accept with real emotion this wreath prepared beforehand, but still fresh and unwithered. But I assure you, mesdames, that I have suddenly become so realistic that I feel laurels would in this age be far more appropriate in the hands of a skilful cook than in mine." "Well, a cook is more useful," cried the divinity student who had been at the meeting at Virginsky's. There was some disorder. In many rows people jumped up to get a better look of the presentation of the laurel wreath. "I'd give another 3 roubles for a cook this minute," another voice assented loudly. Too loudly, insistently in fact. "So would I." "And I." "Is it possible there's no buffet?" "Gentlemen, it's simply a swindle." It must be admitted, however, that all these unbridled gentlemen still stood in awe of our higher officials and of the police superintendent, who was present in the hall. 10 minutes later all had somehow got back into their places, but there was not the same good order as before, and it was into this incipient chaos that poor Stepan Trofimovitch was thrust. End of Part 3, Chapter 1, Section 3.